Hello. Story 1. I was utilizing an online platform known as TradePost as a method for vending various items that I had previously owned but no longer had a need for. These belongings were primarily things I had kept stored away within my residence. My intention was to relocate within the forthcoming months, so I was in the process of systematically organizing and determining which possessions were essential and which were not required. It was during this organizational effort that I came across my older collection of motor tools. They were of a superior standard of quality and remained completely functional. However, not too long ago, I had acquired replacement tools that were powered by batteries. Having no further use for the original set, I captured a few photographic images of them and uploaded a listing onto TradePost. The listing specifically included a power drill driver along with its complementary tool set, priced at $80. Considering their relatively recent age and their fully operational condition, this represented a particularly advantageous offer. It did not take an extended period before I began receiving replies to my advertisement. Within the span of merely an hour, I had received 2 distinct responses to my posted item. One potential buyer sent an electronic mail inquiring if an offer of $50 would be acceptable, but I politely declined that proposition. The second response indicated that the individual was exceedingly interested and expressed a desire to acquire the tools that very evening for the initially listed price. I expressed my concurrence and informed them that I would be accessible at precisely 5 o'clock in the afternoon, should they wish to stop by and collect the items. My standard practice dictated that I would never permit anyone to enter my private residence when conducting transactions for sold goods. My invariable approach was to simply transport the items outside to my driveway and communicate with the buyer at that location. The street in my neighborhood was characterized by a significant volume of traffic, thereby mitigating my concerns about any individual potentially attempting something illicit or unsafe out in the open space. Following my customary procedure, I was planning to be situated outside in the driveway with the tools assembled a little before the designated time of 5 o'clock, anticipating their arrival so that I could execute the transfer as swiftly as possible. However, just past the hour of 4:30 p.m., I heard a rap upon my front door. Peering through the pane, I observed a lone man positioned on my porch. Situated in my driveway was his distinct red vehicle. I opened the door, allowing only a narrow gap, and inquired as to his identity. The man identified himself as being present to purchase the tools that were advertised on TradePost and acknowledged his early arrival. I requested that he hold for a moment and simply await in his automobile, explaining that I was not anticipating his presence at that specific time. He displayed hesitation, which consequently rendered the interaction more uncomfortable than it inherently needed to be. But subsequently, he turned and began to depart. Once he had moved away from the doorway, I collected all the tools together and proceeded to meet him at the upper section of the driveway. I had an electrical outlet located outside that he could utilize for testing the functionality of the tools. He appeared to be contented with their performance. Holding the drill, he abruptly stated, "How about 20?" I responded by reiterating that the established agreement was for $80. I indicated that I would be amenable to accepting a slightly reduced amount, but emphasized that $20 was a figure that was excessively low. I conveyed this politely, despite feeling a degree of slight annoyance, because he had previously consented to compensate $80 for them, and a mere $20 constituted nothing short of a total ripoff. He lowered the drill from his grasp, and without even directing his gaze towards me, returned to his vehicle and drove away. I was left feeling perplexed and distressed, with a sense that I had been manipulated and that my time had simply been wasted. I brought the tools back inside the house and merely continued with my evening, making an effort not to permit myself to become overly agitated about the situation. In reality, I told myself it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. At least, that was my initial assessment. A couple of hours later, as I passed by the front windows of my home, from the periphery of my vision, I caught sight of that same red vehicle. It was positioned further down the thoroughfare, only shadows melting into darkness. Parked approximately 3 residences away from my own, I scrutinized the car closely, attempting to confirm with certainty that it was indeed the identical man, but upon closer inspection, nobody was discernible inside the vehicle. It was simply a vacant, parked automobile, thus providing me with no definitive means of ascertaining his presence. I managed to persuade myself that this occurrence was merely a coincidence and proceeded with my activities. Another hour transpired. I was simply occupied with my routine evening, preparing some food and engaging in watching television. But then, a knock resounded upon my door. I felt a slight tremor of unease, but chose to disregard it, harboring the hope that whoever was outside would eventually depart. Naturally, my primary suspicion immediately gravitated towards the man from the earlier encounter. Only a brief 30 seconds elapsed before the knocking was repeated. "Hey, it's me," a voice proclaimed from the other side of the door. I decided I'll take the tools. I brought the money. I found myself utterly unable to believe his assertion. Everything abruptly coalesced within my thoughts. The realization struck me. The vehicle I had observed an hour prior was unmistakably his, implying that he had been surveilling my dwelling throughout the entire night. I offered no verbal response. Instead, I immediately contacted the local law enforcement authorities, furnishing them with the individual's name and details concerning the vehicle he was operating. The man outside called out several additional times, reiterating his desire to acquire the tools. However, following this, a period of silence ensued for approximately a minute. I remained positioned near my sofa, directing my gaze towards the entrance door. Another minute passed by. I was uncertain as to the appropriate course of action. The police were already in transit and were expected to arrive imminently, which instilled in me a sufficient degree of safety to enable me to inspect through the windows. I proceeded with quiet steps towards the window, situated adjacent to the door. Yet, just at that moment, I abruptly heard something strike the side of the house with considerable impact. The resounding noise was instantly succeeded by the sound of leaves rustling and the distinct rhythm of footsteps rapidly retreating. I peered through the window and saw the man in question running with a noticeable limp towards his car. Providentially, the police vehicles arrived at the precise moment, effectively apprehending him approximately halfway to his destination. To my surprise, upon his capture, the man proceeded to confess to a significant number of details. He stated that he had originally formulated a plan to commit a robbery against me. However, my refusal to grant him entry into the house had significantly complicated his intended actions. Furthermore, he admitted to having attempted to climb a tree located on the side of my residence and endeavored to leap onto the roof structure. Unfortunately for him, he missed his target, impacting the side of the house and sustaining an injury to his leg from the fall. The crucial detail, however, is that he was carrying a knife. Moreover, the section of the roof he had attempted to access was positioned directly beneath my second-story window. Upon subsequently checking, I discovered that this particular window was, in fact, unlocked. Consequently, had he successfully executed the jump, he would have actually gained access to the interior of my home. He purported that his actions were solely an attempted robbery. However, claims are merely assertions and may not represent the full truth. Following this unsettling experience, I completely ceased my utilization of TradePost. Even to this very day, as a direct consequence, I meticulously ensure that every single window in my dwelling is securely locked, including those that I initially believed were positioned too high to be reached. Story 2. Several years prior, I utilized TradePost as a resource to locate a room for rent. My search was focused on finding a residential property where I could reside and share the costs of the rental agreement with one or more individuals. It required approximately 1 week to successfully identify a suitable place that met my criteria. Prior to finalizing the arrangement and being prepared to commence moving in, I engaged in several telephone conversations with the property owner. The owner, who was slated to become my roommate, appeared to be a genuinely ordinary and pleasant person. He seemed to be of a comparable age to myself. He provided me with comprehensive information regarding the dwelling and what I should anticipate. Additionally, I felt as though we established a positive connection during our discussions. With every aspect seemingly ideal, I began to experience a significant sense of anticipation and excitement. I did not possess a large quantity of belongings to transport, so I systematically packed everything I owned and placed it into the trunk compartment of my automobile. In the span of just a few days, I undertook the 30-minute drive to the location that was soon to become my new place of residence. The house was situated outside the boundaries of the main urban area and was located within terrain that was characterized by more wooded surroundings. It featured a lengthy driveway that extended a considerable distance from the primary road. However, upon turning into the driveway and approaching the property, it was immediately apparent that the dwelling did not conform to my expectations. It presented as a dwelling constructed from very old wooden materials. While I was aware that the property had been inherited from his parents, this particular structure appeared to be of considerable age, seemingly at least a century old. In contrast, the visual representations of the interior that I had viewed on Trade Post appeared to be fairly contemporary in design. Consequently, I had assumed that significant renovations must have been undertaken. I opted to leave all my packed possessions within my vehicle as I approached the front entrance and knocked. Aaron, the owner, responded and commenced the process of showing me around the interior. While the external facade was distinctly unimpressive, the interior presented a complete contrast. It was remarkably well maintained, meticulously clean, and had unequivocally undergone renovation relatively recently. I was genuinely pleased with all aspects of the interior. I proceeded to move my personal belongings in during that same evening. Several days elapsed without any discernible issues. It hardly felt as though I had discovered this residence through Trade Post. It felt more akin to simply cohabiting with a close friend. Aaron, however, was employed within the town, which meant he was absent for the majority of the time. As my work was conducted from home, I had the privilege of having the entirety of the house to myself for extended periods. Well, perhaps not the entire house. There existed a singular door within the residence that remained perpetually locked. It was inherently not within the scope of my personal concerns or business, and I was cognizant of this fact, so I never initiated a conversation about it with Aaron. Nevertheless, its locked state persistently sparked my curiosity and caused me to wonder. It was almost certainly the entrance leading to the basement area. Yet this was peculiar because he had previously stated that the house was a one-story structure and had not made any mention whatsoever of the presence of a basement. Another couple of days transpired before an incident occurred. Aaron returned home one evening with fast food for our dinner and subsequently retired to bed early because he was required to work the following day. I remained awake for a slightly longer duration before also retiring. However, while lying in my bed, I experienced difficulty in achieving sleep. There was no specific or identifiable reason for this. It was simply one of those nights when slumber proved elusive. But after a period of time had passed, I clearly heard the sound of Aaron's bedroom door opening. My attention was drawn to listen intently because there were no other sounds or activities to engage my focus. However, initially, no further sounds emanated. I patiently waited for a full 2 or even 3 minutes before I detected the distinct sounds of him beginning to walk. He was moving at a slow pace down the hallway, proceeding directly towards the location of my door. Just as he was in the process of passing by my doorway, he came to a halt. I distinctly heard the wooden floorboards emit a soft creaking sound, which was immediately followed by a gentle thud against the door itself, as though he were pressing his body up against it. He remained situated there, positioned behind my door for a while. I am honestly unable to ascertain the duration of this period, but eventually he began to walk away. His path was not directed back towards his own room, but rather towards the opposite end, leading into the main hallway area. Subsequently, I heard a door open, followed by the sound of it closing. I was at a loss as to what interpretation to place upon these events. It felt genuinely strange and unsettlingly creepy. However, simultaneously, I had acquainted myself with Aaron over a significant period by this point, and had not perceived him to be an individual exhibiting strange behavior. Yet, what exactly was he engaging in, and where precisely had he gone? I consciously remained awake for as long as I could manage, anticipating the sound of his return, but he never came back to his room. Over the course of the subsequent few nights, I began to discern a recurring pattern in his actions. Consistently, every time I would retire for the night, approximately 30 minutes thereafter, Aaron would open the door to his bedroom. He would then remain motionless for a minute. Following this, he would walk towards my door, stand still there once again, and then depart. His destination was always the locked door, which he would then enter. It became evident that he never actually slept within his own bedroom. He consistently spent the night somewhere located behind that peculiar locked portal. What contributed to the overwhelming sense of eeriness was the clear indication that he was exerting significant effort to conceal a secret from me. One particular night, I resolved that I was going to definitively uncover the truth surrounding this entire situation, as I was beginning to experience a growing feeling of being unsafe within the dwelling. I proceeded to bed and patiently awaited Aaron to perform his usual sequence of actions. He duly opened the door to his bedroom and proceeded to walk over to the vicinity of mine. Then, as soon as I heard the distinct sounds of him unlocking and subsequently opening the other door, I quickly rose from my bed and swiftly moved into the hallway. I managed to catch him in the act, standing near the open doorway. He turned his gaze back towards me, his expression clearly indicating that he was startled, his eyes still wide from the surprise I had inadvertently caused him. "Hey, is everything all right, Aaron?" I cautiously inquired. He merely remained stationary, staring at me, his eyes still retaining that wide-open expression from the fright I had given him. Breaking the silence that had settled between us, and feeling a growing sense of impatience, I posed the question directly. "Why do you keep going to that door every single night?" We were positioned on opposing sides of the lengthy, darkened hallway, yet I could distinctly sense that something was profoundly wrong with him. We continued to gaze at each other in stillness. I took a deliberate step closer in his direction. "Aaron." I spoke his name. The very instant I vocalized his name, he abruptly spun around the corner and raced directly towards the back door. He threw it open and continued his frantic flight towards the nearby expanse of trees. I peered out through the back door, observing him as he disappeared into the shadows of the dark woods. I found myself trembling uncontrollably, utterly horrified by the sequence of events that had just unfolded. I lack adequate terminology to articulate the myriad of unknown and unsettling thoughts that were racing through my mind. I closed the rear door, then retrieved a knife from the kitchen area for a sense of security. Subsequently, I proceeded to walk towards the specific door that Aaron had recently opened. It was, as I had suspected, an entryway leading to a basement, but there was no discernible light switch present. It was unequivocally apparent that this section of the property had not undergone renovation, unlike the other areas of the house. The structural walls were composed of old, clearly decaying wooden material. I found myself in a state of internal debate as to whether I should venture down into the basement. I was profoundly intrigued and consumed by curiosity, yet simultaneously overwhelmed by terror. The longer I remained standing there, contemplating the descent, the more intense my fear became. I abruptly turned away and ran back to my room. I hastily packed as many of my possessions as I could manage into 2 suitcases. I crammed them into my car and immediately drove away, never once looking back. I never again initiated contact with Aaron, and he, in turn, never attempted to reach out to me either. I remained ignorant of the nature of his issues, or what activities he was engaged in within that house. However, I was resolute in my decision that I did not wish to become involved in whatever clandestine matters were transpiring. After a significant period had passed, the incident faded somewhat from my memory. Yet, almost 5 years later, I unexpectedly found myself contemplating the events once more. I conducted an online search pertaining to the house and uncovered some peculiar information. It indicated that the property had been demolished several years prior. There was an article dating back to 5 years ago, published merely a few months subsequent to my departure, which explicitly stated that the residence was listed as abandoned. To my understanding, this fact implied that when Aaron had fled that night, he had never returned. I continued reading the available information. It further indicated that the house had been torn down due to what they generically described as criminal findings. The details did not elaborate further on the specific nature of these criminal findings. This particular piece of information genuinely left me feeling profoundly unsettled and shaken for a duration of several weeks. Circumstances of this nature would likely not occur in contemporary times, but the experience served as a stark reminder that one can never exercise excessive caution. Story 3. I am a male, currently 25 years of age, and this particular event transpired approximately 3 years in the past. I had recently finalized the lease agreement for a relatively small house located within the town where I resided. Having spent the preceding few years dwelling in an apartment, I consequently did not possess a substantial amount of furniture or large decorative items to adequately occupy the available area within my rented house. While I was equipped with a reasonably sized sofa and a television stand, the television itself was a mini-sized unit that I had intended to position within my bedroom due to its limited dimensions. Given that I did not have a significant amount of financial resources at my disposal, I turned to the online platform TradePost as a means to locate a larger television unit suitable for the living room space. I discovered several listings for what were described as nice flat-screen televisions on the website. However, they were all priced above my designated budget, and frankly, were considerably more sophisticated and of higher quality than I genuinely required. My primary objective was simply to acquire a large television to effectively fill the empty space in my living room. I was not particularly concerned with the precise quality of the picture displayed on the television screen. Nevertheless, I finally identified one listing that appeared to align with my needs. It was listed at an affordable price, possessed substantial size, and was stated to be in operational condition. It was an older model flat-screen television, likely originating from around 10 years ago. In comparison to the televisions available today, these models are not even typically classified as flat screens anymore, given that they generally measure 3 to 4 inches in thickness and are notably heavy. I dispatched an electronic mail to the listed owner and proceeded with my continued search on the platform. Finding no other listings deemed worthy of further investigation, I simply maintained hope for the best outcome with that particular television. It was not until the morning that followed that I received a reply to my initial email communication. The individual who responded introduced himself by the name of Mitch. He conveyed that he would be delighted to present the television for my inspection whenever I was available. I am uncertain whether I simply interpreted his message in a peculiar manner or if it was genuinely intended this way, but he appeared to be excessively enthusiastic about the prospect. This aspect caused me a slight degree of discomfort. However, I rationalized it by assuming he was simply a cheerful elderly gentleman or similar. I informed him that I would be free to meet on any given day of that week, After I concluded my work commitments at 6 o'clock, Mitch replied, stating that the subsequent day at 6:30 p.m. would be perfectly suitable for him. At the conclusion of his email, he included his residential address. Alongside this information, he also provided a Google Calendar invitation for an event specifically labeled as Trade Post TV. I formally accepted the invitation, despite not being entirely certain regarding its underlying purpose. It was unquestionably not a customary practice that individuals typically engaged in for such transactions. However, it did not appear to negatively impact me in any discernible way. I ensured that my pickup truck was emptied and prepared. The following day, I attended my workplace and subsequently proceeded directly to the address he had provided. By this time, darkness had fallen. As I steered my vehicle into his driveway, I noticed that all the interior lights within the house were illuminated. I performed one final verification to ensure I had the complete amount of cash readily accessible. Following this, I exited my truck and walked towards the front door. As I approached the entrance, I observed that the front door was positioned partially open. There was no outer screen door or any similar barrier. It was simply the primary entrance door. Presuming that it had been deliberately left ajar for my arrival, I inclined my body and carefully peered inside. However, I could not perceive anyone within the immediate vicinity, so I pressed the doorbell button. Coincidentally, precisely as the doorbell chimed, I distinctly heard the sound of something being dropped towards the distant end of the house. Following this noise, a palpable silence descended. There was something about that specific sound that instantly caused me to experience a surge of nervousness. After a brief moment of contemplation, I concluded that I was experiencing a negative premonition regarding this situation and decided that I would simply depart. However, just as I was about to act on this decision, the sound of footsteps became audible, originating from behind the door. Subsequently, the door opened slightly wider, revealing the figure of a man. "Need something?" he inquired, with only one half of his body visible and the other obscured by the doorframe. Yes," I stammered. "I was here to look at your TV. We had scheduled to meet for 6:30 today." The man regarded me with a scrutinizing gaze for a brief moment. Then he simply stated, "All right." He proceeded to open the door fully, granting me entry into the residence. I must state unequivocally that at that precise instant, I recognized that something was fundamentally wrong. His demeanor and comportment were entirely inconsistent with the personality he had projected through his electronic communications. I had anticipated encountering a cheerful elderly gentleman, not a physically imposing, seemingly ill-tempered middle-aged individual. Nevertheless, I had already stepped inside by the time the mental warning signals were intensely activating within my mind. The television set was located within the room, situated directly adjacent to the entrance door. Consequently, the man remained standing there while I conducted my brief visual inspection of the unit. Yes, this appears suitable," I stated. "I'll take it." I uttered these words without even verifying whether the television was actually operational, as my overriding desire was to conclude this encounter as rapidly as possible. I extended my hand, offering the monetary payment. He fixated on the currency for a moment, then shifted his gaze back towards me. He extended his arm, accepted the money, and without hesitation, shoved it into his pocket. Then, providing me with absolutely no opportunity to react, he seized me by the shoulder and forcibly propelled me backwards towards the entrance door, simultaneously yelling at me to leave the premises. I offered no form of protest or argument. Instead, I swiftly sprinted outside to my truck and immediately drove away from the location. Not long after putting some distance between myself and the house, I pulled over to the side of the road. I contacted the police department to inform them that I had just been the victim of a robbery. Throughout the entirety of this ordeal, my primary thought was directed towards the perceived foolishness of the perpetrator. They had agreed to meet me at their own residential address, proceeded to rob me, and then inexplicably allowed me to depart, knowing full well that I was now aware of precisely where they resided. However, upon the arrival of the police at the specified house and their subsequent telephone call to me, I was enveloped in a state of complete shock upon hearing the information they conveyed. Over the duration of that subsequent week, the unfolding circumstances began to become progressively clearer. The individual I had encountered at the house was unequivocally not Mitch. The actual owner of the residence, Mitch, was discovered in the kitchen area, having been rendered unconscious. Thankfully, he ultimately survived the brutal assault, although he had sustained some rather severe injuries. The man I had met at the doorway was, in fact, another customer with whom Mitch had arranged a meeting through Trade Post to finalize the sale of some kitchenware items he was also offering. This individual had evidently ended up violently assaulting Mitch and robbing him, most likely just mere minutes prior to my arrival at the property. What rendered the situation even more astonishing was the revelation that Mitch had extended a Google Calendar invitation to that man as well. Furthermore, the man had accepted the invitation. He had likely done so without realizing that accepting the invite would display his email address, which coincidentally happened to incorporate his full first and last name. Due to this crucial detail, the assailant was successfully apprehended within the span of just a few days. During the course of the investigative case, I had the opportunity to actually meet the real Mitch in person. He was indeed precisely the happy old man I had initially envisioned, even despite the traumatic experience he had recently endured. Bye.